welcome to my talk on React Navigation in React Native called It's Dangerous to Go On. And take this, and I realized I made a reference to Zelda with no Zelda gifts at all, so this is the one and only. There you go. So yeah, a little about me. I'm Gabi Procell if you don't know me, and yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about React Navigation. This is a real intro level too, so if you're not familiar with React Native, that's totally fine. I'll go over what some of the components I'll be referencing refer to, and you'll see that everything will be okay. A little about me. What do I do? A few things I do. Recently, I became an engineer on the Spectrum TV apps quality and architecture team at Charter Communications. So, big change for me. Unfortunately, I'm not working in React Native anymore there. But in my past work history, that was really what I first jumped into the coding world with, was a lot of consultancy work, doing mobile applications for startups, getting their first app off the ground. So that's where that all came from. I'm also the communications lead for Develop Denver, and oh wait, I have animations here. I'm supposed to click, and I don't get off. I'm not looking at this. Okay, Develop Denver, and I'm also a certified veterinary technician. So that was my past life, but also still my current life. I still do that on weekends, but that was also another inspiration for me to get into the world of development as well. Wanted to make some cool apps to make working life a lot easier for that field because it's extremely busy and we don't have a lot of helping hands. And I thought I could do that. Then I realized I had no idea what I was doing, so hopped into a code school and kind of went from there. So yeah, let's get into the rest of this. So let's talk about routing. So unless your life consists of purely true single page applications where you're not routing anywhere at all, you're going to need to do that at some point. On the browser side, one might use something like React Router or just hand roll your own router in some fashion. So why do we need routing? I was kind of surprised. I didn't realize this was a question that people had asked, and while doing some research for what I was going to put into this talk, I realized that some people feel like we don't need to do that. So if we do choose to go purely bare bones with the page you've built in a land where routers don't exist, you'd be requesting from the server whatever content you're trying to get every time that you try to get to that. I do this all the time. I know this. Oh, there we go. All right, so yeah, every time we try to go to an about section or a contact section, we would have to keep requesting that from the server. And that would probably, yeah, again, involve a lot of loading time. You'd have a lot of lags going on and things like that, and it's ultimately a non-ideal user experience. So routers help us to simplify this process by loading all the content we need firsthand, and then we just call that, and it gives us whatever we asked for. So yeah, since we're accessing the content from memory rather than calling the server again, that transition is usually a lot more unnoticeable than it would be if we were to go the other way. So we'll look at a few different ways that a router can work. Okay, so talk a little bit about some dynamic routing. So unlike static routing, which will declare routes as part of the initialization of your app, your dynamic routing takes place as the app is rendering. So that would look like, in React Router at least, having a component wrapped around your main rendered component. So React Navigation sort of offers this, and I'll get a little more into those details too. So, Alright, so let's talk about the concept of stacks. React Native doesn't come packaged with anything that resembles a browser history at all. So when you think about the process of when you click on a link or visit a website, aside from what happens with an API and everything, the router would find that page, put it onto a browser history stack. If you click back, it'll take it off that stack and go backwards. So if we don't have a way to do this, like how are we going to go through our different pages in our application? What if I want to go to my settings? What if I want to go to the main dashboard or whatever other screens or pages you have in your app? So that's where React Navigation steps in to allow us to simulate that browser history with between scenes and then manage that. So it provides a few tools there. So before I get more into routing with React Navigation, I'll go over a quick little high-level view of React Native in case anyone's not super familiar with it. So what it is a framework that allows you to build mobile applications for Android and iOS using React and JavaScript. And the idea and the temptation is that you would write your code once and that code base flows seamlessly across both platforms. It'll use native components rather than web components. And then the same UI foundations that like a Swift or a mobile app would have would also be used in React. They're just wrapped up to look like React and JavaScript. So there are options to use native code as well, and eventually you will have to, the more you get into your mobile application development. So you can plug into things like push notifications, accessing camera features, and sound recording, and playing sound, and all that. All right, and then back to some more Navigator and stack talk. So the commonly used Navigator in React Navigation is called the create stack Navigator. This is a function that will give us that main component that will simulate our browser history, so to say, within our application. So again, yeah, this returns a component that will take in a route configuration object, which is with the key being the route name, and then the value will be the configuration for that route. So, usually a little closer to the screen here. Sorry. So, as you can see here, I'm importing my home screen component into this file, and then I'm defining my app navigator by creating another stack navigator, and this is where I will lay out all the routes that I'll have. So I'll have my home screen, I don't know, if I have a dashboard, I'll put that in there, an about screen, whatever else you want to put in there. You can stick it in there and just define what component that should route to every time you need to go to it. So we get into scene transitions, which is our process of swiping left, swiping right, just moving from screen to screen. In general, in the browser, this would happen via an on-click prop or just linking to some other website in general. But in React Navigation, we pass that navigation prop, which is included in React Navigation, to each screen. And that prop includes a ton of different functions and states and objects that you can use throughout your navigating experience too. So yes, I've got my code here that shows how we would reference that within props. So if I wanted to go to the page called Another Place, I would simply call on the prop navigation, tell it to navigate to another place. And as you can see here, the scene transitions to the next on a press, and this is some of the React Native syntax. So your touchable highlight is one of the types of buttons you might use. And when I press on that, again, I'm accessing that navigate function from within the navigation object and telling it to go to the next scene. And then voila, we go to the next scene. The default behavior for that animation is the slide motion. You can customize that via React Native's animated API, or there's lots of other tools available as well. One that I've seen that I really like too is Fluid Transitions, which has some pretty cool different animations in there. Alright, scene stacking. So we've got several different methods, like I mentioned, for getting around the navigation stack. You can go to the requested scene, as we've seen before, with navigate. And that will go there if it isn't already within your stack. You could navigate to the same scene multiple times with the push function, which will just keep pushing that same scene back on the stack. And you can also navigate backwards with a go back function, or just to the beginning with a pop to top function. So those are the pretty common ones that you would end up using. And so here's a little demo of push function versus navigating. So I'm just navigating to, I try to navigate to home, but then when I push the go to home function, that's calling a push function, and we just keep pushing that scene back onto it. And navigation provides several, I'm sorry, no, I already talked about this. So here's the go back function too. This is also by default included in the back button, which is typically in the top left corner. And then we'll go over a little bit of the life cycle of navigation as well. So if you're familiar with React's lifecycle methods, those still apply in your React Native applications. But the way they're used might be a little bit different in React navigation. So what would happen, think about what would happen to a screen when the user enters the screen, when they're leaving. So this is where some of those extra lifecycle methods will step in. So if we have a stack navigator with our home screen and a dashboard screen, and after navigating to the home screen, its component did mount lifecycle is called. So we push the dashboard screen onto our stack, which would then call that component did mount lifecycle onto that dashboard component. So now we would have our two mounted components in our stack. Now if we try and do this backwards and going from the dashboard to home, component will unmount, will be called on the dashboard, but it won't be called on the home component at all. So we'll have in our mounted components list home, and then unmounted will be dashboard, since we've peeled that off of the stack. So going through a few more of those extra lifecycle methods that get put into here. We do have things you can subscribe to called will focus, which will reflect when the screen comes into focus. We also have did focus, which will tell us when the screen has been focused. This will happen after the screen transition has happened. And then will blur for when we're going to leave the screen. And did blur again after that screen transition has happened, and when we've already left the screen. And times you might want to subscribe to this might be for different alerts, if you wanted to set up something that'll automatically happen on the next page, things like that. They're not things I've used very commonly, but they are available too. So another hugely helpful feature with React Navigation is the ability to pass parameters between your routes too. In my experience, this has proved helpful with things like nested components or nested routes. Maybe if I have a list of objects that will navigate to the same page, but I want that information to be dynamic every time that I go to it, I could do that. So think of something like IMDb, where you have a list of actors, which will ultimately lead you to the actor screen, and it's the same for every actor, it just has different information on it. So this can be used to navigate on push functions, and your navigate functions too. And your parameters are passed as an object after your route declaration. So as you can see here, I have called that navigate function. I told it what screen I want to navigate to. And then I want to pass in this object. Say I just passed in an address there. And then that should show up on the next page when I access the state within the navigation prop. Excuse me. All right, so here's a bigger example of that, where I'm rendering a flat list, which in React Native is a way to render a list of objects by mapping over a set of data that you feed into it. So I'm just going to render a huge list of these buttons here. And I want each button to navigate to the same page, but I'm going to pass in the same information to each button. And I'll have a visual example of this too. So I made a little app called a patient checker, which will check on my patients, which are just my dogs right now. If I click on Sophie, it'll take me to what is essentially the patient's page and have her name in it. It'll tell me any alerts that she's super stinky and loud. If I take it to Tucker, it'll tell me he likes his butt rubbed. And then Enzo, he's just scared of everything. So that information essentially is going to the same component, but just giving different information. All right, and this is just an example of what that data looks like that would go into a flat list. Ideally, it's within an array and then has an object with IDs. You saw my warnings there because I didn't name my keys correctly. So it's short on time, but ideally that is what that would look like, and it would pull all that data from there as you saw fit. So another thing that is very common that you'll want to access is header configuration. That'll make things customizable to the brand of your app. It'll promote that just unified style across the app. So by default, that comes as a plain old gray bar that just sits at the top. With a back button if you need to travel backwards in your stack too. So there's a lot of different configuration options available for that between your text, text style, the size, colors. You can put animations in there. Last time I tried to work with that, it's a little tricky and laggy and not as great. And you can even call this as a static function within your component to apply more dynamic styles, like we were doing with the pages with the different dogs too. So as you can see here, from the home screen, so the example at the top is what would be within my main stack navigator, where I'm defining what that home screen is. I can tell it from there to access my navigation options, which will include access to the header and whatnot. And I can configure the title from there. I can call it home, I can call it whatever I want to. That component, however, does not have access to any other props unless I pass that in a kind of painful way. So an easier way of going about that, if I wanted to make that title more dynamic, would be to declare a static function and access those navigation functions from the screen that I want to change it within. So this will override everything you've stated previously in your main stack navigator, and I can just tell it to give me a different title there, which will just be the patient name. And then, so yeah, when I click on the patient name, it will then reflect their actual name that gets passed in. And then this is a little bigger, so you can see what that declaration looks like too. You can also configure, like I said, the left and right buttons too. Maybe you want a profile button on your right side. You would do that there, or that would go to info, like I'm doing here. Maybe you want your back button to look like something else, or just to say something in general. And you could do that there as well. So you can see here, that code essentially would change that header right button to display info, and then whenever I would click on it or press on it, it would go wherever I told it to go within that static function. You also have the ability to share styles within your entire navigation stack too. So you can declare default styling options too, which is also great for promoting that unity in styles across the whole application. And makes it a lot easier so you don't have to fly around trying to define the same styles in a million different places too. And again, those can also be overwritten with navigation options in each screen. And so just to summarize what we've covered today, so we have a quick start with React Navigation, and that'll allow you to easily get going on your mobile app with built-in navigators. And just remember that React Native doesn't come pre-packaged with the browser history at all. So that prompts us to simulate that with React Navigation. And having the ability to manage stacks is also a huge help, so that we can easily transition between our screens. We've also discovered some of the basic functions like go back, push, pop to top, navigate, and there's a ton more in there that can be used in very special case scenarios. And there's also an ability to make it your own and customize your navigation to promote that fluidity and that unity across your styles in your application too. So yeah, there's millions, not millions, but lots of different ways to do that too. A lot of things that I found very helpful in my journey to learn more about this was simply the documentation. It's really well written too. So between React Native documentation and the navigation documentation, that was all pretty stellar as well. And yeah, I apologize if I finished way sooner than I anticipated, but I'm definitely taking any questions if you have any.